Some people decide your value before you ever open your mouth. Ethan Walker learned this the moment he stepped into the conference room and saw Blake Morrison look through him, not at him. It was not an obvious insult. That would have been easier to fight. It was quieter than that. Colder. Blake did not smirk. He did not raise his voice. He simply gave Ethan the kind of glance that said, without words, "You are not someone I need to take seriously." And the dangerous part was not Blake's look. The dangerous part was that Ethan felt himself believe it. His shoulders tightened. His breathing changed. His mind started rushing to prove, explain, defend, earn. Before he had spoken a single sentence, he had already entered the room like a man asking for permission to matter. And people can sense that. They may never admit it, but they feel it. They feel when you are trying too hard to be accepted. They feel when your confidence depends on their reaction. They feel when your silence is not power, but fear. Ethan had spent years thinking respect came from saying the right thing at the right time. He believed that if he could just make a stronger argument, give more details, sound more prepared, people would finally see him clearly. But that was the trap. The more he tried to be taken seriously, the more he looked like someone waiting to be approved. Blake understood this without needing to name it. Hidden game. The world does not only listen to your words. It listens to your relationship with yourself. Ethan did not walk into that room as a weak man. He walked in as a man who had not yet learned how to hold his own weight in the presence of judgment. There is a difference. Weakness is not feeling pressure. Everyone feels pressure. Weakness is letting pressure rewrite your posture, your voice, your boundaries, and your sense of worth. Blake did not need to control Ethan. He only needed to create a small emotional disturbance and watch Ethan control himself poorly. That is why the first law is brutal. Before people take your words seriously, they measure whether you take yourself seriously. They measure it in your pace, in your stillness, in whether you can tolerate a pause without collapsing into explanation, in whether your eyes stay steady when someone tries to make you feel invisible. Ethan thought the meeting began when he started speaking. But the truth is, the meeting began the second he entered the room. His body had already spoken. His hesitation had already spoken. His hunger to be respected had already spoken. And Blake had heard all of it. This is not about becoming cold. Could make Ethan reread his own words 5 times, wondering if he had sounded too direct, too soft, too needy, too much. And this is where the game becomes dangerous, because it does not look like a game while you are inside it. It looks like being polite. It looks like trying to keep the peace. It looks like being professional. But underneath, something else is happening. Someone applies a little pressure, and you reveal how much of your inner authority still belongs to them. You see this in offices all across America. A manager walks into a room with no expression, and suddenly everyone changes their voice. A coworker leaves your message on read, and your mind starts creating stories. A friend becomes distant, and instead of asking what is real, you start auditioning for your old place in their life. A parent makes one disappointed comment at Thanksgiving dinner, and the adult child becomes 12 years old again, explaining choices they no longer need permission to make. This is not weakness. This is conditioning. Somewhere along the way, many people learned that safety comes from being approved of. So when someone like Blake withholds approval, the nervous system treats it like danger. Ethan had always thought he was just being considerate. Start listing your value like evidence in a trial. The tragedy is that you think you are proving yourself, but what they often see is dependency. They see that your center can be moved. They see that your emotional weather changes when they change their tone. And once people feel that kind of power over you, even decent people may begin to respect you less, because human beings are not only moral creatures. They are responsive creatures. They respond to signals. Ethan's signal had always been, "Tell me how to feel about myself." Blake's signal was, "I will decide whether you matter here." That is why the room felt uneven before the conversation even began. Not because Blake was better, not because Ethan was less capable, but because Ethan entered every tense moment trying to earn the ground beneath his feet, while Blake stood as if the ground already belonged to him. And once Ethan saw that, something in him went quiet. Not peaceful yet, not powerful yet, but awake. Ethan's mistake was not that he cared what people thought. Everyone cares. The mistake was that he reacted before he understood what was happening inside him. Blake would pause, and Ethan would rush. Time, but with his emotions. If Blake approved, Ethan felt steady. If Blake ignored him, Ethan started sinking. That is not respect. That is dependency wearing a professional suit. You see this everywhere. The employee who answers late-night emails instantly because they fear being seen as replaceable. The woman who explains her boundaries 3 different ways because she cannot tolerate someone being disappointed in her. The son who still overperforms around his father, hoping this will finally be the year he hears pride instead of criticism. The friend who becomes more generous every time they are treated with less care. They all think they are earning closeness, safety, or respect, but often, they are training others to expect access without effort. Ethan had trained the room to believe he could be interrupted. He had trained Blake to believe discomfort would make him shrink. He had trained himself to believe that tension meant he had done something wrong. That was the deepest wound. Not Blake's behavior, Ethan's interpretation of it. He treated pressure as proof that he needed to perform harder. But pressure is not always an instruction. Sometimes pressure is just information. It shows you where you are still attached. It shows you whose opinion still owns too much space in your nervous system. It shows you the exact place where your self-respect becomes negotiable. Ethan began to realize that every time he over-explained, he was secretly asking Blake to release him from uncertainty. Every time he reacted too quickly, he was saying, "Your discomfort matters more than my composure." Every time he tried to be perfectly understood, he abandoned the quiet strength of being okay with being misread. And that is a rare strength. Most people cannot stand being misunderstood for even 5 seconds. They chase, defend, correct, justify, and expose too much of themselves. Then they wonder why they feel drained after every interaction. But the truth is simple and brutal. If people can use your need to be understood against you, they can control the rhythm of your mind. Blake had found Ethan's rhythm. A little distance, and Ethan moved closer. A little doubt, and Ethan explained more. A little silence, and Ethan filled it. The game was not that Blake had power. The game was that Ethan kept responding as if Blake did. The hidden law is this. The person who controls their reaction controls the position. Ethan did not understand that at first. Influence over the emotional frame. Realization was not comfortable. It was easier to blame Blake. It was easier to say Blake was cold, dismissive, controlling, and unfair. And some of that was true. But truth that only blames another person does not always free you. Sometimes it keeps you attached to the same cage, waiting for the person who hurt you to become kinder before you become stronger. Ethan started seeing the pattern in places far beyond the office. He saw it in the way his sister could call at the last minute and expect him to rearrange his evening, because he had always said yes before thinking. He saw it in the way old friends teased him in ways that bothered him, then acted surprised when he finally looked uncomfortable, because he had spent years laughing along to avoid tension. He saw it in dating, in the way he responded too quickly, gave too much, revealed too much, and then wondered why the other person treated his presence like something guaranteed. The pattern was humiliating, but it was also liberating. Because if he had taught people access, he could teach them limits. If he had taught people that silence made him panic, he could teach them that silence no longer moved him. If he had taught people that he would over-explain under pressure, he could teach them that one clear sentence was enough. This is where self-mastery begins. Not with becoming untouchable, not with pretending nothing affects you, but with taking responsibility for the signals you keep sending when you are afraid. Most people want a new life while broadcasting the same old instructions. They want respect while rewarding disrespect with more attention. They want peace while entering every emotional trap as if it is an emergency. They want to be taken seriously while treating every doubtful look like a command to prove themselves. Ethan had done that for years. He had mistaken availability for kindness, explanation for honesty, and self-abandonment for maturity. Blake was not creating Ethan's weakness from nothing. He was exposing a rule Ethan had already been living by. If someone pulls away, chase. If someone doubts you, perform. If someone disapproves, shrink until they feel safe again. That rule had kept Ethan socially acceptable, but it had also made him easy to steer. And the darkest part was that many people around him preferred him that way. Not because they hated him, but because a person without firm boundaries is convenient. A person who explains too much is easy to exhaust. A person who fears disapproval can be controlled without anyone ever raising their voice. Ethan understood then that respect is not something you demand after years of training people to ignore your limits. It is something you rebuild through repeated, quiet evidence that you no longer betray yourself to keep others comfortable. The next time Blake looked at him with that same flat, assessing stare, Ethan felt the old instinct rise. Explain. Soften. Proof. But beneath it, something new appeared. A colder clarity. He did not need to fight Blake. He needed to stop obeying the version of himself Blake knew how to trigger. The first technique Ethan learned was not to speak less because silence looks powerful. That is shallow. He learned to speak less because every reaction needed to pass through his control before it reached the room. When Blake asked a question with that familiar edge in his voice, Ethan no longer answered instantly. He paused. Not to punish Blake. Not to create fear. Not to play a game. He paused because his nervous system needed to learn that pressure was not an emergency. One slow breath. One steady look. 1 second of choosing instead of obeying. That was where the shift began. Controlled silence is not emptiness. It is ownership. It says, I do not need to fill every space just because someone else made it uncomfortable. Ethan began using it everywhere. In meetings, when someone interrupted, he did not fight for dominance. He waited, then calmly returned to his point. As I was saying, at home, when his sister tried to pull him into a last-minute obligation, he stopped giving long explanations. He simply said, I cannot do that tonight. No courtroom speech. No emotional apology. No attempt to make his boundary feel convenient. A cold boundary is not cruelty. It is a clean edge. It tells people where you end without inviting them to negotiate your self-respect. Ethan also stopped trusting words more than patterns. Blake could say, I just want the best idea in the room, but Ethan watched what happened after people disagreed with him. Did Blake listen, or did he punish them with distance? Did he respect clarity, or only obedience? This mattered because people often reveal their character through repeated behavior, not polished language. In relationships, in families, in offices, words can be theater. Patterns are evidence. Ethan no longer argued with every performance. He observed. And observation gave him distance. Distance gave him choice. Choice gave him frame. Frame was the hardest lesson. Holding frame meant Ethan no longer let Blake define what the moment meant. If Blake went silent, Ethan did not decide it meant he had failed. If Blake looked unimpressed, Ethan did not decide it meant he needed to prove more. If the room felt tense, Ethan did not automatically become responsible for everyone's comfort. He kept the internal frame simple. I am here to communicate clearly, not to beg for approval. That sentence changed how he moved. His voice slowed. His answers shortened. His eyes stopped searching the table for permission. He began to understand that self-mastery is built in the small delay between stimulus and response. Someone tests you, and you do not immediately become the version of you they expect. Someone doubts you, and you do not empty your entire mind onto the floor. Someone withdraws warmth, and you do not chase it like your value is leaving with them. This is not manipulation. Manipulation tries to control another person's mind. Self-mastery protects your own. Ethan was not trying to make Blake feel weak. He was learning how not to become weak under Blake's pressure. That difference matters. Dark psychology becomes dangerous when it is used to dominate. But it becomes protection when it helps you recognize the invisible hooks people place in your emotions. The hook of silence. The hook of guilt. The hook of delayed approval. The hook of making you explain yourself until you forget what you originally knew. Ethan did not remove those hooks by becoming colder than Blake. He removed them by refusing to pull on them himself. And slowly, Blake began to notice something had changed. The old moves no longer produced the old Ethan. A pause no longer made him rush. A stare no longer made him shrink. A challenge no longer made him surrender his frame. Ethan had not become unreadable because he hid everything. He became unreadable because his reactions were no longer for sale. Ethan did not announce that he had changed. That would have ruined it. Real power rarely enters the room with a speech. It enters through behavior that no longer asks to be noticed. The first person to feel it was not Blake. It was a woman from finance named Claire who interrupted Ethan during a budget review the way people had done many times before. Normally, Ethan would have smiled, backed up, and let his point dissolve into the air. This time he stayed still. He did not glare. He did not compete. He simply waited until the interruption ended, looked back at the room, and said, I want to finish this part first. Nothing dramatic happened. No one gasped. No one challenged him. But the room adjusted. That is how real authority often appears. Not as domination, but as a quiet refusal to disappear. Ethan began noticing how much of his old life had been built around unnecessary motion. He used to answer messages as if every notification was a command. Now he lets them sit, not to punish anyone, but because urgency was no longer allowed to own him. He used to explain why he could not attend every dinner, every favor, every last-minute request. Now he gave clean answers. I am not available. That does not work for me. I need more time before I respond. At first, people tested the edges. They always do. His sister asked, "Why are you being so serious lately?" An old friend joked, "You are acting different." Even Blake gave him a longer look in the hallway, as if trying to find the old handle and discovering it was gone. This is the moment many people retreat. They feel others noticing their boundaries, and they mistake that discomfort for guilt. But Ethan had learned the difference. Guilt says you harmed someone. Discomfort says you stopped playing a role they benefited from. Those are not the same. In meetings, his voice became slower. His sentences became cleaner. He stopped decorating every point with nervous softness. The strange thing was, the less he tried to impress people, the more they listened. Not everyone liked it. That is important. Self-mastery does not make everyone approve of you. Sometimes it exposes who preferred you anxious, available, and easy to steer. But approval was no longer the prize. Control was. Inner control. Emotional control. The ability to remain intact while someone else tried to create movement in him. And something else began to happen. Ethan became harder to read. Not fake. Not distant. Just less emotionally available to every passing pressure. People no longer knew exactly which comment would make him explain, which silence would make him chase, which look would make him shrink. That uncertainty created a different kind of presence around him. A quiet gravity. Blake felt it most clearly during a project update, when he questioned Ethan's numbers in front of the team. The old Ethan would have rushed into defense. The new Ethan paused, looked at the report, then said, "The assumptions are on page 4. The conclusion still holds." Then he stopped talking. The silence after that sentence was different. It did not belong to Blake anymore. It belonged to Ethan. And for the first time, Blake was the one who had to decide whether to fill it. That is the hidden power of controlled silence. It does not beg to be believed. It stands there and lets others reveal themselves. Ethan had not become louder. He had become heavier. His presence had weight because his emotions were no longer scattered across the room, waiting for someone else to arrange them. People can feel that. They feel when you are no longer performing for the chair you sit in. They feel when your calm is not weakness, but discipline. They feel when your silence is not fear, but a locked door. And once they feel that, they may not understand you as easily, but they begin to take you seriously. Blake waited until the room was full before he tested Ethan again. That was the point. Pressure is different when people are watching. It does not only touch your confidence, it touches your image. Ethan had just finished explaining a recommendation when Blake leaned back, folded his hands, and let a long silence stretch across the table. Then he said, "That sounds confident. I just hope it is not overconfidence." A few people glanced down. Someone shifted in their chair. The old Ethan would have felt heat rise in his chest. He would have rushed to soften the moment, to prove he had done the work, to make Blake comfortable with his certainty. But this time, Ethan did not move toward the bait. He let the sentence land. He let the room feel it. He looked at Blake with a calm that did not ask for permission and said, "The risk is accounted for. The backup plan is already in the document." Then he stopped. No extra defense. No nervous smile. No emotional offering. Blake waited for more, because the old rhythm said more should be coming. But nothing came. And in that silence, something shifted. Blake's comment, which had been designed to make Ethan explain himself, was now sitting alone in the room. Without Ethan's reaction feeding it, it looked smaller, almost unnecessary. This is the moment people miss. When someone throws pressure at you, they often expect you to complete the attack by reacting. They give you the hook, but you are the one who pulls it deeper. Ethan did not pull. Blake tried again later, colder this time. "You have gotten very brief lately," he said in the hallway, with the kind of tone that pretends to be casual while searching for a wound. Ethan understood the invitation. Defend your change. Explain your boundaries. Prove you are still friendly. Reassure me that I can still move you. Instead, Ethan gave a slight nod and said, "I have gotten clearer." That was all. Blake smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. For the first time, he had to work harder to read Ethan, and that made the balance feel different. Ethan was not overpowering him. He was not humiliating him. He was simply no longer cooperating with his own diminishment. At lunch, the social pressure came from another direction. Claire joked that Ethan had become mysterious, and a few people laughed. Before, he might have performed warmth to prove. He was not taking himself too seriously. This time, he smiled lightly, stayed relaxed, and did not rush to explain. He allowed people to have their reaction without trying to manage it. That is a deeper form of strength than most people realize. Letting others misread you without panicking. Letting silence exist without decorating it. Letting a joke pass without turning yourself into the punchline to make everyone comfortable. By the afternoon, Blake's coldness no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like information. Ethan could see it now. Blake was not just evaluating the project. He was checking whether the old Ethan was still available. The one who overexplained. The one who chased approval. The one who became smaller when the room tightened. But that version was not answering anymore. And when the meeting ended, Ethan noticed something subtle. People asked him questions directly. They waited for his answers. Even Blake paused before responding, not because he had been defeated, but because the frame had changed. Ethan had stopped treating Blake's reactions as the center of the room. And when you stop orbiting someone else's judgment, they can feel the loss of gravity. Ethan did not become a different man overnight. He became less available to the old version of himself. That was the real transformation. Not the slower voice. Not the stronger eye contact. Not the cleaner boundaries. Those were only the visible signs. The deeper change was that he no longer treated other people's reactions as instructions. Blake could be cold, and Ethan did not become desperate. Claire could joke, and Ethan did not perform. His sister could question his tone, and Ethan did not collapse into guilt. The world had not suddenly become softer. Ethan had become harder to move. And that is when identity begins to change. For years, he had lived as if his value was a fragile object being passed from hand to hand. A manager could raise it. A friend could lower it. A partner could confirm it. A stranger could damage it with a look. He thought he was being sensitive, thoughtful, aware. But underneath, he was outsourcing the center of himself. Now he was taking it back one reaction at a time. He still felt pressure. He still noticed silence. He still heard judgment in certain voices. But the difference was that he no longer obeyed the first emotional command. Fear would rise, and he would watch it. The need to explain would appear, and he would let it pass. The urge to be liked would knock at the door, and he would not always open it. This made him quieter, but not empty. Warmer, but not available to everyone. Clearer, but not cruel. People began to sense that Ethan's calm was not a performance. It was a boundary with a pulse. Blake sensed it too. He could still challenge Ethan, but he could no longer make Ethan abandon himself on command. And once that old power disappeared, Blake's presence became smaller. Not because Blake changed, but because Ethan stopped making him larger than he was. That is the part most people never understand. The person you fear often grows inside your reaction. You feed them with your overthinking. You build them with your explanations. You crown them every time you treat their approval like oxygen. Ethan had done that for too long. But now, when he walked into a room, he no longer entered as a question. He entered as an answer. Not arrogant. Not untouchable. Just settled. A man who knew he did not need to prove his right to take up space before he could use his voice. And the strange thing about self-respect is that it does not need to demand attention. It changes the air around you. People pause differently. They listen longer. They test less casually. Because somewhere beneath language, they understand that you are no longer negotiating your own worth. Ethan finally saw the hidden rule. Respect begins when you stop asking the room to tell you who you are. It begins when your silence is no longer fear, your calm is no longer weakness, and your boundaries no longer arrive with apologies. Blake had not lost. Ethan had simply stopped surrendering. And sometimes that is the most powerful victory there is. When you stop reacting like someone who needs approval, the world starts treating you like someone who has value. This is not only Ethan's story. It is the quiet test happening in your own life every day. At work, people may listen to your words, but they study your boundaries. They notice whether you accept interruptions. They notice whether you answer every request like an emergency. They notice whether one doubtful look can make you explain yourself for 10 minutes. In love, People notice whether distance makes you chase, whether coldness makes you overgive, whether inconsistency makes you fight harder for a place that should never require begging. In family, they notice whether guilt still works on you, whether one disappointed tone can make you abandon your plans, whether you still shrink around people who remember the younger version of you. With friends, they notice whether jokes at your expense are allowed, whether your time can be taken casually, whether your kindness comes with no edge, no limit, no self-protection. Most people are not consciously trying to control you, but human beings adapt to what you repeatedly permit. If you keep rewarding pressure with access, pressure will return. If you keep rewarding disrespect with explanation, disrespect will learn your language. If you keep rewarding emotional distance with pursuit, distance becomes the tool that moves you. The lesson is not to become cold. The lesson is to become clear. Your boundary is your silent biography. It tells people what kind of treatment can enter your life and what kind must stop at the door. And once you understand that, every relationship becomes more honest. Not easier, more honest. Because people do not only reveal who they are by how they treat you, they reveal who they expected you to remain when you finally stop allowing it. Dark psychology becomes dangerous the moment you use it to make other people smaller. Ethan had to understand this clearly, because the same knowledge that protects you can corrupt you if your ego gets hungry. Silence can be a boundary, or it can become punishment. Distance can be self-respect, or it can become emotional control. Reading people can help you protect your peace, or it can become a way to exploit their wounds. The difference is intention. Real power does not need to trap people. It does not need to make them anxious, dependent, or confused. Toxic control says, I want you to lose yourself so I can feel strong. True power says, I will not lose myself just because you are trying to move me. Blake used pressure to see who would bend. Ethan learned pressure so he would stop bending unconsciously. That is the line. You are not learning these laws to become colder than the people who hurt you. You are learning them so you can recognize the hook before it enters your skin. So you can hear guilt without obeying it. See silence without fearing it. Feel rejection without crawling toward it. The world approaches them. Blake still watched Ethan sometimes, but now his look did not enter Ethan's body like a command. It stayed outside. A signal. Nothing more. Ethan observed more than he reacted. He listened for patterns, not promises. He measured behavior, not tone. He protected his peace without announcing it. And slowly, the old hunger disappeared from his presence. The hunger to be chosen. The hunger to be understood. The hunger to make every person see his value before he could feel it himself. What replaced it was heavier, quieter, harder to fake. Self-possession. The kind that does not need applause. The kind that makes your silence feel complete. Ethan had not become a mystery by hiding who he was. He became a mystery by no longer letting every room decide who he had to become. By the end, Ethan no longer needed Blake to change. That was the final sign that something inside him had become free. Blake could still be cold. People could still test him. Rooms could still go silent. But Ethan no longer treated every uncomfortable moment as a threat to his worth. He had learned the difference between being challenged and being controlled. He had learned that respect is not begged out of people with more words, more effort, or more emotional exposure. It is built when your behavior proves that your value does not collapse under pressure. The old Ethan wanted the room to approve of him before he felt steady. The new Ethan brought steadiness into the room first. That is the shift most people never make. They spend years waiting for someone to stop dismissing them, stop provoking them, stop playing with their emotions, when the deeper freedom begins the moment they stop handing over the remote control. You do not become powerful by making everyone respect you. You become powerful when disrespect no longer makes you abandon yourself. You stop chasing every silence. You stop explaining every boundary. You stop turning every cold look into a verdict. And slowly, people begin to feel that something in you is no longer available for use. Not your peace, not your identity, not your nervous system, not your need to be chosen. That is when you become difficult to manipulate. Not because you are harder, darker, or crueler than others, but because you are finally rooted in yourself. Ethan walked out of that office one evening with no dramatic victory, no applause, no final confrontation. Just a quiet sense that he had taken back something he should never have given away. His presence, his timing, his right to remain calm, his right to be misunderstood without collapsing. And maybe that is what real power looks like in ordinary life. Not a throne, not control over people, not a room full of fear, just the ability to stand inside pressure and not become someone else. Because the world will always test what you believe about yourself. Some people will test it with silence, some with criticism, some with affection they give and remove, some with guilt dressed as love. But once you see the pattern, you no longer have to perform inside it. You can pause, you can observe, you can choose. And that choice is where the game changes. When you stop reacting like someone who needs permission to exist, you become the kind of person others cannot easily define, disturb, or direct. You are no longer chasing respect from the outside. You are carrying it from within. And when you finally see the game, you are no longer the pawn.